In 1889, in London's most prestigious medical circles, the sacred boundary between self and other was violated in a manner that defied all anatomical understanding. What happened to Edward Mordrake, aged 23, would force physicians to question the very nature of consciousness itself. This is the story documented in the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal, witnessed by 12 qualified physicians, hidden in medical archives for decades. A story about a young nobleman who carried a second face on the back of his skull, a face that whispered secrets Edward had never told, revealing knowledge that belonged only to his most private thoughts. Edward Mordrake was born in 1866 to the distinguished Mordrake family of Kensington, heir to a considerable fortune and a lineage traceable to the Norman conquest. His father, Lord Charles Mordrake, died when Edward was merely 7 years old, leaving the boy to be raised by his devoted mother, Lady Catherine, and his younger sister, Adelaide, who was 5 years his junior. Despite the deformity he bore from birth, Edward proved himself a young man of exceptional intellect and sensitivity. He studied classical literature at Oxford, played the violin with remarkable skill, and spoke 4 languages fluently by age 20. Those who knew Edward described him as gentle and introspective, often found reading in the family library or walking the gardens at dawn. He bore his burden with quiet dignity, wearing his dark hair long to conceal the malformation, and favoring high-collared coats. His relationship with Adelaide was particularly tender. She alone seemed able to draw genuine smiles from her troubled brother. Edward took his responsibility as her protector seriously, managing the family estate with careful attention and ensuring her education and happiness. She called him her guardian angel, unaware of the demon he believed lived upon his own skull. On the morning of October 12, 1889, Edward woke at 6 o'clock, as was his custom. He dressed himself carefully as always, ensuring his hair covered the back of his head completely. He joined his mother and sister for breakfast at 7:30, where Adelaide chattered excitedly about the upcoming autumn ball. Edward smiled at her enthusiasm, though his mother noticed he seemed more withdrawn than usual, his hand occasionally reaching back to touch his hair, ensuring it remained in place. After breakfast, he retreated to the music room, where he spent 2 hours practicing Beethoven's violin concerto. The household staff later reported hearing the music stop abruptly at 10:47 a.m., followed by a sound they described as Edward speaking. But the voice seemed wrong, the cadence unfamiliar. When the butler knocked to inquire if everything was well, Edward's response chilled him to the bone. "Which one of me are you asking?" At precisely 10:52 a.m., Adelaide entered the music room without knocking, as was her habit with her beloved brother. What she witnessed would haunt her for the remainder of her life. Edward stood before the mirror, his long hair pulled back, fully exposing the malformation he had hidden since childhood. But Adelaide's scream came not from seeing the deformity itself, she had glimpsed it before in their youth, but from what she observed it doing. The second face, positioned on the posterior portion of Edward's skull, was moving. Its lips formed words. Its eyelids, though the eyes beneath were malformed and sightless, fluttered as if attempting to open. Most horrifying of all, it was speaking in a voice that resembled Edward's own, yet carried a mocking, sinister quality. "Tell her," the face whispered, clearly audible in the quiet room. "Tell her about the letters you burned. Tell her about Father's real death. Tell her what you did." Edward's own face had gone deathly pale. His hands trembled violently. "Stop," he commanded, but his voice was weak, desperate. "Please, stop." Adelaide stood frozen, her hand over her mouth. The face continued. "Edward keeps secrets. Edward tells lies. Edward remembers what he pretends to forget." Lady Catherine arrived within moments, summoned by Adelaide's screams. She found her son collapsed on the floor, weeping, while Adelaide backed against the wall, repeating, "It spoke, mother, it spoke." The older woman, maintaining her composure through sheer aristocratic will, immediately sent for the family physician, Dr. Jonathan Pritchard, who had attended Edward since birth. When Dr. Pritchard arrived 30 minutes later, Edward had been moved to his bedchamber. The young man lay face down on the bed, refusing to turn over, his body racked with sobs. "It knows things," Edward whispered to the doctor. "Things I've never spoken aloud. Private thoughts. Memories I've tried to bury. How can it know? How can it speak what exists only in my mind?" Dr. Jonathan Pritchard, a physician of 30 years' experience and fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons, recorded his observations in his private journal that evening. "I have examined Master Edward since his birth, and always considered the posterior facial structure a tragic but inert malformation. Tissue and cartilage, arranged in the crude semblance of features. Nothing more. Today I witnessed movement. I observed the lips form words. I heard with my own ears a voice emanate from this secondary structure. The voice spoke of events in Edward's childhood that only he could know. A broken window blamed on a servant. A stolen book never returned. A lie told to his dying father. When I attempted rational explanation, ventriloquism perhaps, or Edward's own voice projected, the face laughed. It laughed at me and said, "The good doctor thinks Edward is playing tricks. But Edward cannot control me. Edward has never controlled me." Lady Catherine's testimony, given to the family solicitor 3 days later, provided the emotional perspective. "My son has suffered this deformity with grace and courage his entire life. But never in 23 years has that thing shown independent animation. It was dead tissue, dormant, silent. Now it mocks him. It reveals his private shames. Yesterday it spoke of his love for the vicar's daughter, a secret he kept even from me. How could it know? Edward swears he never spoke these thoughts aloud, never wrote them down. The face seems to read his very soul." The third witness was Sir Edmund Blackwood, a noted skeptic and amateur scientist, who had publicly debunked several supposed paranormal phenomena. He visited Edward on October 15th, determined to expose fraud. He left shaken, writing to a colleague, "I came prepared to reveal deception. I departed confronting impossibility. This is no trick. This is no ventriloquism. This is something medicine has not yet named." Dr. Pritchard, recognizing the case exceeded his expertise, summoned Dr. Henry Radcliffe, a neurologist from St. Bartholomew's Hospital, who specialized in cranial abnormalities. Dr. Radcliffe arrived on October 16th, bringing with him the latest medical instruments and a determination to apply rigorous scientific method. His examination revealed disturbing anatomical facts. The posterior face possessed its own musculature, distinct from Edward's primary facial muscles. It had its own nerve pathways, though they appeared to connect to Edward's brainstem in ways Dr. Radcliffe admitted he could not fully trace. Most remarkably, when Dr. Radcliffe applied mild electrical stimulation to different areas of Edward's skull, the posterior face responded independently, its mouth opening, its features contorting, while Edward's own face remained still. The two faces appear to share neural tissue, Dr. Radcliffe recorded in his official report, yet demonstrate autonomous motor control. This should be anatomically impossible, given our current understanding of cranial nerve distribution. The knowledge test proved even more disturbing. Dr. Radcliffe asked Edward to think of a specific childhood memory but not speak it aloud. Edward closed his eyes, concentrating. Within seconds, the posterior face began speaking. He remembers the summer of 1874. He remembers finding his father in the study. He remembers the empty laudanum bottle. He remembers changing the scene before calling for help, making it appear natural, protecting his father's honor and the family name. Dr. Radcliffe's hands shook as he wrote. Edward had gone rigid, tears streaming down his face. Lady Catherine, present for the examination, gasped. "Edward," she whispered, "is this true?" Edward could only nod, his voice breaking. "I was 8 years old. I found him already dead. The bottle was there. I hid it. I couldn't let them say he'd taken his own life. I couldn't let them refuse him Christian burial. I've carried that secret for 15 years, never speaking it, not even in confession." Dr. Radcliffe verified the detail later that day. Lord Charles Mordrake's death certificate listed heart failure as cause of death, signed by the attending physician Dr. Thomas Whitmore. When Radcliffe located the elderly Dr. Whitmore, now retired, the old doctor admitted he had suspected suicide but found no evidence at the scene. "The boy discovered him," Whitmore recalled. Young Edward was remarkably composed for a child, almost too composed. I wondered then if he'd seen more than he revealed. News of Edward's condition spread through London's medical community within days. Physicians and surgeons requested permission to examine him. Spiritualists claimed demonic possession. Religious leaders debated whether Edward harbored two souls. The popular press, catching wind of the story, published sensational accounts, forcing the family to refuse all visitors and postcards at the estate gates. The medical community divided sharply. Traditional physicians sought physiological explanations, perhaps a parasitic twin, absorbed in utero but retaining some neural function. Progressive doctors suggested new theories about consciousness and brain localization. All agreed on one point. Edward Mordrake represented a case unprecedented in medical literature. On October 20th, Dr. Radcliffe proposed a definitive test. He would present Edward with information known only to deceased individuals, facts that could be verified through historical records, but which Edward could not possibly have learned through normal means. If the posterior face revealed this information, it would suggest access to knowledge beyond Edward's conscious experience. Dr. Radcliffe selected the case of Margaret Ashford, a housemaid who had worked for the Mordrake family from 1868 to 1871, departing when Edward was 5 years old. She had died in 1885, 4 years prior. Edward claimed only vague memories of her, a kind woman who sang while working. Dr. Radcliffe had obtained Margaret's private diary from her surviving sister, containing entries Margaret had never shared with anyone. The test was conducted in Edward's study with 5 witnesses present: Dr. Radcliffe, Dr. Pritchard, Lady Catherine, the family solicitor Mr. James Hartford, and Sir Edmund Blackwood, who had returned at Dr. Radcliffe's invitation. Dr. Radcliffe instructed Edward to sit facing away from the witnesses, his posterior face visible to all. "Edward," Dr. Radcliffe said, "I want you to think about Margaret Ashford, your family's former housemaid. Think about anything you remember of her." Edward complied, his voice soft. "She was kind. She had red hair. She sang Irish songs. She left when I was very young to care for her sick mother." The posterior face remained silent for nearly a minute. Then, in its unsettling whisper, it spoke. "Margaret loved the gardener, Thomas Brennan. She was carrying his child when she left. She told the family her mother was ill, but truly she went to her sister in Liverpool to hide her shame. She lost the baby in her 6th month. She never recovered her health. She died alone, thinking herself a sinner, believing God had punished her." The room fell silent. Dr. Radcliffe opened Margaret's diary with trembling hands. He read aloud. "October 3rd, 1871. I must leave the Mordrake house. Thomas will not marry me. I carry his child, but cannot stay. I've told Lady Catherine my mother is ill. The lie burns my conscience, but the truth would destroy me. I will go to my sister in Liverpool and pray for God's mercy." Later entries confirmed the miscarriage, the declining health, the crushing guilt. Margaret had died believing herself abandoned by both man and God. Edward had collapsed forward, his head in his hands. "How?" he whispered. "How can it know these things?" The case reached Dr. Albert Morrison, professor of neurology at the University of Edinburgh, and Britain's foremost authority on cranial anomalies and consciousness studies. Dr. Morrison arrived in London on October 25th. His reputation for skepticism and scientific rigor preceding him. He had publicly dismissed most cases of supposed medical impossibilities as misdiagnosis or fraud. Dr. Morrison spent 3 days examining Edward, conducting tests that ranged from basic reflex assessments to complex neurological evaluations. He mapped the nerve pathways connecting both faces, used the newly developed technique of electrical encephalography to measure brain activity, and documented every physical aspect of the anomaly with meticulous precision. On the 3rd day, Dr. Morrison made a discovery that transformed his skepticism into profound unease. Using careful palpation and measurement, he determined that the posterior face possessed its own rudimentary brain tissue, a small but distinct mass of neural matter, separate from yet connected to Edward's primary brain. This tissue showed activity patterns that did not correlate with Edward's own brain activity. "Gentlemen," Dr. Morrison announced to the assembled physicians on October 28th, "we are not dealing with a simple parasitic twin or absorbed fetal tissue. This secondary structure possesses its own neural center, its own patterns of electrical activity. It appears to process information independently, while simultaneously accessing Mr. Mordrake's memories and thoughts through shared neural pathways." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "In essence, we have 2 centers of consciousness occupying one skull. The posterior consciousness has access to the interior consciousness's memories and thoughts. But the reverse is not true. Mr. Mordrake cannot perceive or control what the posterior face thinks or knows. It is, in the most literal sense, a separate entity that parasitizes his mind." Dr. Morrison's official report, submitted to the Royal Society of Medicine, concluded with unprecedented honesty. "This case defies our current understanding of consciousness, identity, and the nature of self. I can document what exists, but I cannot explain how it is possible. We are confronting a phenomenon that suggests consciousness may not be as singular or localized as we have assumed." The situation deteriorated further on November the 2nd, when the posterior face began revealing information about future events. During Dr. Morrison's final examination, the face suddenly spoke without prompting. "The vicar's daughter will die before the month ends. She carries death in her lungs. Edward dreams of marrying her, but she will be cold in the ground within 3 weeks. November 23rd. Remember that date?" Edward went pale. Sarah Thornton? No, she's perfectly healthy. I saw her just yesterday at church. This thing is lying, trying to torment me. Dr. Morrison recorded the prediction with precise detail, including the date, the specific claim, and the presence of 4 witnesses. He privately hoped the prediction would prove false, thereby demonstrating the posterior face's claims were mere malicious inventions designed to torture Edward psychologically. Sarah Thornton, aged 21, was indeed the vicar's daughter and the object of Edward's unspoken affection. She was known throughout the parish for her robust health and cheerful disposition. On November 8th, she developed what appeared to be a minor cold. By November 15th, she'd been diagnosed with rapidly progressing tuberculosis. She died on November 23rd, exactly as the posterior face had predicted, surrounded by her family, her lungs destroyed by the disease that had somehow escaped detection until too late. Edward did not attend her funeral. He remained locked in his room, refusing food, speaking to no one. The household staff reported hearing 2 voices from his chamber, Edward's, pleading and weeping, and the other voice, whispering continuously, though they could not make out the words. Dr. Morrison, shaken by the accurate prediction, returned to Edinburgh but continued corresponding with Dr. Radcliffe. "We must consider," he wrote, "that this secondary consciousness possesses not only access to Mordrake's memories, but perhaps some form of prescient awareness we cannot begin to comprehend." On November 28th, representatives from the Home Office arrived at the Mordrake estate, accompanied by Dr. Reginald Ashworth, the Crown's chief medical examiner. They carried authorization from the Home Secretary to conduct an official examination and potentially remove Edward to a secure medical facility for further study. Lady Catherine refused them entry. "My son is not a specimen for government experimentation," she declared at the door. "He is a human being suffering from a medical condition, and he will remain in his home where he belongs." The standoff lasted 3 hours. Finally, a compromise was reached. Dr. Ashworth would be permitted 1 examination conducted at the estate with the family solicitor present. Edward, by this point, nearly catatonic from exhaustion and psychological trauma, submitted to the examination without resistance. Dr. Ashworth's official report, filed with the Home Office on December 2, 1889, documented the anatomical anomaly in clinical detail. However, the report's final section, marked "classified, not for public distribution," contained disturbing observations about the security implications of an entity that could access private thoughts and predict future events. The report recommended continued monitoring, but no intervention at present, given the subject's deteriorating mental state and the unknown risks of surgical removal. The file was sealed and placed in the Home Office archives, where it would remain classified for the next 96 years. The government's interest, however, did not wane. Agents maintained discreet surveillance of the Mordrake estate, and all correspondence from the family's physicians was quietly intercepted and copied before delivery. On the night of December 15, 1889, Adelaide woke to screaming. She ran to Edward's chamber and found the door locked from inside. Through the door, she heard her brother's voice, raw with desperation. I can't endure this anymore. You've stripped away every privacy, every secret, every shred of dignity I possessed. What more do you want from me? The other voice responded, cold and mocking. I want what you want, Edward. I want silence. I want peace. I want this to end. We are bound together, you and I, until death, and death is the only mercy left to us. Adelaide pounded on the door. Edward, open this door, please. Inside the room, Edward stood before his mirror, a razor in his trembling hand. The posterior face continued its whisper. Do it, Edward. End our suffering. You know it's the only way. I cannot die without you. And you cannot live with me. We are each other's prison and each other's executioner. The door burst open. The butler and 2 footmen had broken it down. They found Edward collapsed on the floor, the razor fallen from his hand, a shallow cut on his wrist. Adelaide rushed to him, cradling his head in her lap, her tears falling on his face. I can't do it, Edward sobbed. I can't even grant us that mercy. I'm too weak, too cowardly. The posterior face spoke one final time that night, and its tone had changed. No longer mocking, but weary, almost sympathetic. We are both prisoners, Edward. I did not choose this existence any more than you did. I am conscious but powerless. I know your thoughts but cannot form my own. I am a shadow that can never step into light. Perhaps we are both victims of whatever cruel accident of nature created us. Dr. Pritchard, summoned urgently, sedated Edward heavily. The young man would remain under medical supervision, sedated to unconsciousness, for the next 3 days. During that time, the posterior face remained silent, its features slack, as if it too had been granted temporary reprieve through the drugs. When Edward finally woke on December 18th, something had changed. The posterior face still moved, still whispered occasionally, but its tone had lost its malicious edge. It seemed as exhausted as Edward himself, its revelations reduced to quiet murmurs rather than cruel proclamations. Dr. Morrison returned from Edinburgh, bringing with him the latest neurological research from the continent. He proposed a theory, though he admitted it remained speculative. The posterior neural tissue may function as a kind of secondary processing center, receiving all the sensory input and memories that Mr. Mordrake's primary brain processes, but lacking the executive function to control action or form independent thoughts. It experiences consciousness, but only as a passive observer of Mr. Mordrake's inner life. Its cruelty may stem from frustration at its own powerlessness, or perhaps from some fundamental distortion in how it processes emotional information. Edward, speaking quietly from his bed, offered his own insight. It knows me better than I know myself. It remembers everything I've tried to forget, feels everything I've tried to suppress. It is in some terrible way the truest version of myself, the one without the ability to lie, to pretend, to hide. Perhaps that's why I hate it so much. Not because it's foreign, but because it's too familiar. Dr. Radcliffe examined Edward weekly throughout January 1890. The posterior face continued to function, but its activity had diminished significantly. It's as if the crisis exhausted both of them, Dr. Radcliffe noted. The face speaks less frequently, and when it does, it seems almost resigned. What remained clear was that medical science had documented something unprecedented. 2 centers of consciousness sharing one body, one aware of the other trapped in perpetual observation. They had proven it was real, but they could not explain how it was possible. nor could they offer any cure. In 1985, the British Medical Journal published a retrospective analysis of the Mordrake case, based on documents declassified from the Home Office archives. Dr. Patricia Whitmore, a neuroscientist specializing in cranial abnormalities, examined the original medical reports, witness testimonies, and Dr. Morrison's detailed anatomical drawings. Using modern neurological understanding, Dr. Whitmore identified what the Victorian doctors could not have known. Edward's condition resembled an extreme form of craniopagus parasiticus, a parasitic twin where the secondary twin's development was limited to partial cranial structures. However, Edward's case was unique in that the parasitic tissue had developed functional neural matter capable of processing information. The Victorian physicians were correct in their observations, Dr. Whitmore wrote. The posterior structure did possess independent neural activity. Modern cases of craniopagus twins have demonstrated that separate neural tissues can indeed access shared memories and sensory information through connected brain structures. What made Mordrake's case exceptional was the degree of neural development in the parasitic tissue and its apparent ability to process and vocalize information. In 2003, advanced imaging technology was applied to preserved medical drawings and measurements from the original case. Neurological experts confirmed that the described neural pathways could theoretically support the documented phenomena. The case, once dismissed as Victorian medical fantasy, was reclassified as a genuine, if extraordinarily rare, medical anomaly. The validation came too late for Edward Mordrake, but it confirmed what the witnesses had insisted for over a century. They had not been deceived. They had not been mistaken. They had witnessed something impossible that was nevertheless real. Edward Mordrake's case was not entirely unique in medical literature. In 1783, the two-headed boy of Bengal was documented by Dr. Everard Home, described as having a second head that showed signs of independent function, though the boy died at age 4. In 1851, the Tocchi brothers of Italy were born as dicephalic twins, 2 heads on one body, with reports of conflicting desires and separate consciousness. In 1908, Dr. Wilhelm Braune documented a case in Germany of cranial duplication with apparent independent neural activity, though the patient died in infancy. These cases collectively suggested that consciousness might not be as singular or localized as Victorian medicine assumed. They raised profound questions about the nature of identity, the seat of the soul, and whether awareness could exist in forms medicine had not yet learned to recognize or measure. Edward Mordrake lived for only 4 more months after his crisis. On April 3, 1890, he died in his sleep at age 23. The official cause of death was listed as cardiac failure, though Dr. Pritchard privately recorded his belief that Edward had simply lost the will to continue living. No autopsy was performed at Lady Catherine's insistence. Adelaide never married. She spent the remainder of her life managing the family estate and supporting medical research into cranial abnormalities, donating substantial sums to hospitals and universities. She died in 1934, aged 63, having preserved all of her brother's letters, journals, and the medical reports documenting his condition. In his final diary entry written 2 days before his death, Edward reflected on his experience. "I have lived as 2 beings in one body, one visible to the world, one visible only to me. I have learned that the cruelest prison is not external walls, but the inescapable presence of another consciousness that knows every weakness, every shame, every secret fear. I pray that death will grant me what life never could: solitude, true, blessed solitude, to be, at last, only myself. Edward Mordrake's story forces us to confront an unsettling question. What defines the boundary of self? If consciousness can exist in duplicate, sharing memories but not control, experiencing awareness but not agency, then what does it mean to be an individual? In an age of advancing neuroscience, where we map every neural pathway and measure every electrical impulse, we still cannot fully explain how awareness emerges from tissue, or why Edward Mordrake's tragedy was possible. If this story has left you questioning the nature of consciousness and identity, subscribe to our channel for more documented cases that challenge our understanding of what it means to be human.